In the midst of the dense forests and pristine rivers of North America, the first settlers from Europe left their traces. With every step, they planted the hope for a new life, and at the same time the seed for a country that would one day shape the entire world, the United States of America. They fled poverty, oppression, and religious persecution. But the new land demanded its price. Conflicts, suffering, and bitter struggles determined the path. But how did individual simple settlers become a superpower that dominates oceans, skies, and even space? In this video, we travel together through over 250 years of American history and discover how a small colony found the courage to break away from a global empire. Why civil war, immigration, and the American dream have shaped the character of an entire nation, and above all, what lessons we Europeans can still draw from this today regarding the division of power and the fragility of democracy. Stay tuned, because the next few minutes will take you from the first shots in Boston to rockets launching into space, and to the small, often unknown stories that changed the world forever. Let's go. It is the year 1750. Along the wild Atlantic coast of North America, over 1.5 million people have settled. Most of them come from England, Ireland, the Netherlands, or Germany. They fled hunger, poverty, or religious persecution, and sought a new beginning here, thousands of kilometers away from their old home. For many, America was a promise, a place where one could achieve anything with hard work that seemed unattainable in Europe. But this promise had a dark side. The New World was by no means an empty wilderness. Millions of indigenous people had lived here for millennia in tribes such as the Iroquois, Powhatan, or Cherokee. For them, the arrival of the Europeans meant disease, displacement, and often death. Flourishing colonies emerged on the East Coast. In the North, people lived from fishing and trade with Europe. In the South, however, the warm climate was used to operate huge plantations, primarily for tobacco, rice, and cotton. Here began what would later become America's darkest chapter: the transatlantic slave trade. Wealthy plantation owners bought African slaves to farm the fields profitably. Human destinies became merchandise, and out of greed for profit grew a system that would shape generations. In the West, the Appalachians drew a natural border. Behind them lay New France, a French colony where the fur trade played the main role. Tensions fermented between the British, French, and indigenous tribes, a powder keg that was soon to explode. Europe in the 18th century was a powder keg of rivalries, greed for power, and old enmities. When the 7 Years' War broke out in Europe, it had wide repercussions. It is considered the first true world war in history, and its theater extended into the deep forests of North America. In America, two great empires fought for land, trade, and influence: Great Britain and France. The British had firmly established themselves along the Atlantic coast, while the French had built a lucrative fur trade network in the vast hinterland from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi. But in the eyes of the settlers, the boundless land west of the Appalachians was the key to wealth and freedom. They pushed further and further inland, directly into French territory, and onto the land of numerous indigenous tribes. Conflicts were inevitable. The battles fought in the dense forests of North America were merciless. British troops, colonists, and allied tribes faced French soldiers and their indigenous allies. Entire villages burned, and fur trading posts changed hands several times. In the end, in 1763, Great Britain emerged victorious. New France became British, but the victory came at a price. The war devoured vast sums. To cover the war debts, the British Crown demanded new taxes and duties from its colonies. For many settlers, this was a provocation. They felt used and patronized without having a voice in distant London. A rebellion was in the air. After the expensive victory in the 7 Years' War, the British Crown urgently needed money. So London decided to ask the American colonies to pay more, imposing new taxes on newspapers, documents, and above all on tea. For the colonists, this was more than just a tax issue. They were tired of being ruled by a parliament in London in which they themselves had no seat. Their motto became the famous phrase, "No taxation without representation." In Boston, a rebellious port city, the protest came to a head. On December 16, 1773, colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians sneaked aboard 3 merchant ships of the British East India Company. Under the moonlight, they opened chest after chest, a total of 342, and threw the precious tea into the icy harbor water. This image went around the world. The Boston Tea Party became a symbol of resistance against oppression and arbitrariness. The British reaction was harsh: a harbor blockade, soldiers in the streets, and strict laws. But instead of taming the colonies, they fueled even more anger. All over America, people gathered in taverns and churches, read pamphlets, discussed, and for the first time dreamed seriously of independence. The spark was lit, and it spread like wildfire. After the Boston Tea Party, delegates from 12 colonies joined together in 1774 for the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. They no longer wanted to be just subjects, but to have a say, and if necessary, to fight. In the spring of 1775, the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. Farmers, craftsmen, teachers, simple people later called patriots, stood up against one of the most powerful armies in the world. George Washington, an ambitious plantation owner from Virginia, was appointed commander-in-chief. He led an army that was barely trained, poorly armed, and poorly paid. But they fought for an idea of freedom. On July 4, 1776, something happened that changed the world. The Second Continental Congress solemnly declared the independence of the United States of America. With quill and ink, they established that all men are created equal, words that would move generations. The war was hard. Many battles were lost, entire cities burned. But the Patriots found allies. France, still bitter about its defeat in the 7 Years' War, sent money, weapons, and above all, ships. In 1781, the decisive turnaround succeeded with the surrender of British troops at Yorktown. 2 years later, in the Treaty of Paris, Great Britain acknowledged independence. A new country was born, young, proud, and full of contradictions. The independence was won, but the real challenge began only now. 13 colonies, as different as their landscapes, from the trading center of Boston to the plantations in Virginia. Everyone wanted to keep their own freedom, and at the same time shape a common future. Initially, the new states tried the so-called Articles of Confederation, a loose alliance, but it quickly became apparent that without a strong central government, chaos threatened. Trade stalled, and disputes between the states increased. In 1787, delegates met again in Philadelphia. In the stifling summer heat, they discussed for days behind closed doors. Arguments, compromises, and heated speeches filled the hall. In the end, a document emerged that had never existed before: The Constitution of the United States. Firmly anchored in it was the separation of powers. Congress was to make laws, the President to execute them, and the Supreme Court to check their compliance. A system of checks and balances to prevent abuse of power. But even this experiment was not perfect. Women, indigenous peoples, and most African Americans remained without a voice. Many saw it as a promise, and at the same time a task for future generations. A new capital was intended to strengthen the sense of unity. Washington, D.C., in the middle of the East on the Potomac River. From here, the young country was to grow westward, over mountains and rivers. For many Americans, the West was more than just a direction. It was a promise, an infinite space full of possibilities, fertile soils, gold, and adventure. After the ratification of the Constitution, more and more pioneers dared to set out beyond the Appalachians. With covered wagons, livestock, and the Bible in their luggage, families moved deeper inland week after week. In 1803 came a massive boost. France sold the USA the huge Louisiana Territory, an area twice as large as the country at that time. President Jefferson sent the expedition of Lewis and Clark to explore the new wilderness. Their journey led over rivers, mountains, and endless prairies all the way to the Pacific. But where new dreams flourished, old cultures were destroyed. Numerous indigenous tribes who had lived in these areas for generations lost their homeland. Peaceful negotiations often failed due to greed and misunderstandings. More and more reservations were created, often in inhospitable areas, far from their ancestral hunting grounds. A dark chapter of this time was the Trail of Tears. Thousands of Cherokee, Choctaw, and other tribes were forcibly resettled. Many died on the way from hunger, cold, and disease. At the same time, the gold rush in California lured thousands of fortune seekers from all over the world to the West Coast, where once only buffalo herds roamed. Tent cities, saloons, and railway lines grew within months. The West became a myth with cowboys, gunslingers, and railroad tracks connecting continents. But not only Mexico looked with concern at the growing American hunger for land. America grew, and with it its hunger for land. In the south lay Texas, once part of Mexico, then a rebellious province into which more and more settlers from the United States moved. In 1836, Texas declared its independence and fought against Mexico, with famous scenes like the Alamo Mission, where a small team of defenders offered legendary resistance. A few years later, in 1845, the USA annexed the young Republic of Texas, much to the annoyance of Mexico. The border lines remained disputed, tensions escalated, and in 1846 it came to open war. American troops advanced as far as Mexico City. After 2 years of fighting, Mexico had to cede huge territories in the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo, California, New Mexico, Arizona, and parts of Colorado and Utah. The USA thus expanded almost to the Pacific. But with the new land came new conflicts. In California, the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in 1848 triggered a true rush. People from all over the world flocked there, driven by the hope of quick wealth. But behind the gold and the vastness lay tensions. Should slavery be allowed in the new states or not? The dispute split North and South even deeper. To connect the new territories, investments were made in railroads, and even a first connection via Panama was created long before the famous canal. While the West boomed, a deep rift grew between North and South that would shake the entire country. While gold and new land beckoned in the West, A conflict grew in the East that was much older than any border: the question of slavery. The South built its entire economy on plantations and cotton. Without the labor of millions of enslaved Africans, this wealth would have been unthinkable. For many rich plantation owners, slavery was a necessity; for others, a sin that morally poisoned the young country. In the North, where industry and trade flourished, the abolitionist movement grew. Newspapers, sermons, courageous speeches. Everywhere they demanded the end of slavery. People like Harriet Tubman risked their lives to secretly lead slaves to freedom via the Underground Railroad network. With every new state that emerged in the West, the question flared up: should slavery be allowed here or not? Compromises did not last long, and mistrust grew. In 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin was published, a novel that shook millions of people in the North awake and showed what slavery really meant. For the South, the book was a provocation; for many in the North, a wake-up call. When Abraham Lincoln, a declared opponent of the expansion of slavery, was elected president in 1860, that was the last straw for many Southern states. One state after another seceded from the Union and founded the Confederate States of America. What followed was the bloodiest conflict America has ever experienced. The United States, so young and proud, broke apart at its deepest wound. In 1861, the American Civil War ignited after 11 Southern states had declared their independence. Families were torn apart. Brothers fought on different sides. Neighbors suddenly stood opposite each other as enemies. In the North, the Union formed under President Lincoln. In the South, the Confederacy under Jefferson Davis. The fronts ran across the country from Virginia to Mississippi. It was a war of fields and forests, of rails and rivers, and it was a war of industries. The North had factories, railroads, and more men. The South fought with heart and soul, but fewer resources, and hoped for help from Europe, which never came. Lincoln dared a courageous step. With the Emancipation Proclamation, he declared all slaves in the rebellious states to be free. Thus, the war became more than just a fight for unity; it became a fight for freedom. The battles of Gettysburg, Antietam, and many others claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Cities lay in ruins, fields burned. But in the end, the Union prevailed. In 1865, the Confederates surrendered. Slavery was abolished. Over 4 million people received their freedom on paper. In reality, new forms of oppression, racial segregation, violence, and the terror of the Ku Klux Klan began. Many African Americans sought a better life in the cities of the North. Others remained in the South as tenant farmers on the same plantations where they were once enslaved. After the scars of the Civil War, America needed hope, and found it in progress. The second half of the 19th century transformed the country into a workshop of the world. Steam engines, railroads, and huge factory halls changed the everyday life of millions. Where fields and small workshops once stood, smokestacks soon towered into the sky. The dream of one's own farm gave way to the call for work in the city. Millions of Europeans, Irish, Italians, Poles, Germans, came across the Atlantic seeking work, security, a better life. New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh grew at a breathtaking pace. But the promise of prosperity had dark sides: long shifts, child labor, miserable wages. A few industrialists, later called robber barons, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, amassed gigantic fortunes and controlled steel, oil, banks, and railroads. Meanwhile, the railroad rolled into ever new areas. It connected the Atlantic with the Pacific, carried grain and coal from west to east, and brought even more settlers to the last corners of the continent. For the remaining indigenous tribes, this meant reservations, confinement, and often hunger. The workers began to fight back. Strikes, unions, and protest marches demanded safer working conditions and fair wages. Not infrequently, factory owners reacted with private militias, or called the National Guard. But despite all conflicts, something new emerged in this time, an America that became a synonym for Europeans, for upward mobility and unlimited possibilities. At the end of the 19th century, America no longer looked only to the West, but out into the world. The economy was booming. The factories ran day and night. But those who produce a lot need new markets. The USA began to think beyond its coasts. Wherever trade, raw materials, or strategic bases beckoned, they wanted to have a say. A first target was Hawaii, an island paradise in the middle of the Pacific, important for trade with Asia. In 1898, the USA annexed Hawaii, a step that took away the independence of many Hawaiians. Almost simultaneously, America turned to another empire, Spain. In Cuba, a Spanish colony, resistance was brewing. The USA supported the insurgents, also out of their own interest. When the U.S. battleship Maine exploded in the harbor of Havana in 1898, the cause for war was there. The Spanish-American War lasted only a few months, but its consequences were huge. The USA won and took over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. For the first time, they held colonies overseas, far from their mainland. The debate at home was fierce. Some saw the USA as a new world power. Others feared that America would betray its ideals if it became a colonial power itself. But the new role was decided. The next big step followed in Central America, the Panama Canal. First, the French failed due to the jungle and diseases. Then the Americans took over the project, even supporting Panama's independence from Colombia to secure the construction work. In 1914, the canal was opened. It connected the Atlantic and Pacific, saved ships weeks of travel time, and finally made the USA a naval power with global influence. At the beginning of the 20th century, the USA experienced an apparent contradiction. Internally, the economy boomed, but externally, they initially stayed out of the great conflicts of Europe. When the First World War broke out in 1914, the USA declared its neutrality. But American factories ran at full speed. Food, weapons, and ammunition went to Great Britain and France. But the war came closer. German submarines sank merchant ships, even with U.S. citizens on board. An intercepted telegram in which Germany proposed an attack on the USA to Mexico was the final straw. In 1917, the United States entered the war. 2 million soldiers crossed the Atlantic, fighting in the trenches of France. Many of them saw Europe for the first time. 110,000 young Americans never returned. After the victory of the Allies, the USA had a new place in world politics. President Woodrow Wilson dreamed of a more peaceful order, the League of Nations. But at home, many Americans wanted to return to neutrality. They never joined the League. In the 1920s, people lived as if in a frenzy: jazz, cars, cinemas, skyscrapers. But the stock market crash plunged millions into misery, a time that brought poverty and despair. When the Second World War began in 1939, the USA initially remained on the sidelines again. Only the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 changed everything. America armed up, sent troops to Europe and the Pacific, and built airplanes and tanks at a record pace. On the battlefield, they helped defeat Nazi Germany. In the Pacific, the decision finally fell. 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced Japan to surrender. After 1945, Europe lay in ruins. The USA supported the reconstruction, also in Germany, and finally rose to become a superpower. But the world remained divided. A new, invisible war began. After the Second World War, 2 superpowers faced each other: the USA and the Soviet Union. 2 worlds, 2 ideologies, 1 race for power and influence. Europe was divided. In the West, the Marshall Plan and democracy. In the East, Soviet influence and communist regimes. The Iron Curtain cut the continent in half. The fear of nuclear war hovered constantly over everything. Both sides built huge arsenals of nuclear weapons, enough to destroy the Earth multiple times. Children in American schools practiced duck and cover, hiding under desks, as if that could protect against a bomb. It was a war without an open battlefield, but with many hot moments. The Berlin blockade, where U.S. planes supplied West Berlin. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when Soviet missiles were stationed on Cuba, only 90 miles from the U.S. coast. The world stood on the brink of nuclear war, but at the last minute, Kennedy and Khrushchev reached an agreement. The competition shifted into space. In 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the USA with Sputnik, the first satellite in orbit. But the USA caught up with Apollo 11, which brought the first human to the moon in 1969. A triumph for America's self-confidence. Meanwhile, both superpowers fought proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam. Here, America paid a high price. Millions of soldiers fought far from home. Many returned broken. At home, resistance grew. Students demonstrated against the war. Civil rights movements demanded equality for African Americans, women, and minorities. The spies of the CIA and the KGB played a dangerous game of hide and seek. Intrigues, assassinations, and double lives characterized this era of shadows. When the wall fell in Berlin and the Soviet Union collapsed, the world breathed a sigh of relief. While America fought against communism abroad, another decades-long struggle raged internally, the one for equality. Despite the abolition of slavery, many African Americans still lived in poverty and under strict racial segregation, especially in the South. Separate schools, buses, and restaurants were everyday life. Anyone who objected risked violence. But in the 1950s and 60s, a new generation rose up, peaceful, courageous, determined. People like Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat on the bus for a white person, and Martin Luther King Jr., whose speeches moved millions. His famous, "I Have a Dream," became the voice of an entire movement. Hundreds of thousands marched to Washington, protested in Birmingham, sat in restaurants where they were not served, and they forced change. The Civil Rights Act officially ended racial segregation. The right to vote was secured for everyone. Parallel to this, other groups also demanded their rights. Women wanted equal pay and equal opportunities. Indigenous Americans fought against discrimination. Society changed, not always smoothly, but irreversibly. In this time, the counterculture also emerged. Hippies preached peace and love. Students demonstrated against the Vietnam War. America wrestled with itself, between tradition and awakening. But while equality was being fought for inside, the USA remained a world policeman on the outside. In the 1970s, the USA became aware of something that was stronger than any atomic bomb: their dependence on oil. In 1973, During the Yom Kippur War, the USA supported Israel. In response, the OPEC states imposed an embargo, the oil price exploded, cars queued at gas stations. The economy wavered. America, the land of unlimited possibilities, felt its limits. Meanwhile, the USA became entangled deeper and deeper in conflicts in the Middle East. Iran, once a close ally, became an Islamic republic and a bitter opponent after a revolution in 1979. The hostage taking at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran shocked the world. In Afghanistan, the USA slipped into a new chapter of the Cold War. To weaken the Soviet occupation, they supported the Mujahideen, the same fighters from whom parts of the Taliban later emerged. The 1990s began with a new war. When Iraq under Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the USA led an international coalition to end the invasion. The Gulf War became a symbol of American military power, but America's presence in the Middle East nourished hatred. Radical Islamists, including al-Qaeda, saw the USA as an enemy image. Terrorist attacks against U.S. embassies and ships increased, a grim omen for September 11, 2001. The history of America is a history full of contradictions, a country that promises freedom, but must struggle for equality again and again. A country that wages wars to create peace, and yet often reaps new conflicts. After the shock of September 11, 2001, the USA led the war on terror. In Afghanistan, they toppled the Taliban. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein. But the region remained restless. New terror groups emerged. Many soldiers returned home traumatized. Economically, the country experienced highs and lows. The financial crisis of 2008 shook millions of families. The gap between rich and poor grew. But America reinvents itself again and again. High-tech, Silicon Valley, cultural trends. Often the new comes from the USA. Today, many continue to see the USA as a world policeman, but also as a divided society. Debates about gun ownership, racism, immigration, climate protection, and the role as a superpower determine everyday life. But one thing remains: the USA is a land of ideas and dreams. Nowhere else are there so many stories of people who have created something great out of nothing. Nowhere else do so many cultures collide and create something new. For Europe and for us, America's history shows, democracy is never taken for granted. Freedom must be defended again and again. Equality fought for again and again. And even today, millions of people all over the world look to America to see if the promise of the American dream still lives. And now it's your turn. Which station of this journey moved you the most? Write it in the comments. Share your thoughts with us. If you liked this journey through time, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned as we discover the next exciting story of world history together. See you soon, and stay curious.